welcome everybody. This is a Beam Exchange webinar. We call it Grab the Mic because it's a place for MSD practitioners to share their experiences and their lessons and to hear questions and answer them. So today, I'm very pleased to say we're going to be talking about greening the MSD approach in agriculture, which is the title or a short version of the title of a new guidance manual that the DCD has just published. And I'm very, very pleased to say that we have the lead author of that, Clara Garcia Parra here. She is a senior consultant at the Canopy Lab, specializes in systems thinking and holds an MBA in circular economy and innovation. So she's a very appropriate person to talk about this subject as the lead author of the MSD, greening the MSD approach. And then she's going to be supported in this webinar by three other speakers who are going to be talking about practical examples of greening the MSD approach from their work in the field. So we have Mohasin Kabir, who is CEO of PRISMA. He has 15 years experience managing MSD programs and is something of an expert in climate adaptation finance. And his colleague, Gracia Christie, who is head of portfolio for PRISMA. She will also be talking about PRISMA's work. Garcia leads their work developing inclusive business models for agricultural commodities in Indonesia and oversaw the work in the rice seed sector that she's going to be talking about. And finally, we have Innocent Thindwa, who is a country intervention manager for Casa, a FCDO funded program in Malawi, and he is again an MSD practitioner with lots of experience. I think 9 years experience in this kind of work. So before I hand over to these speakers and give them about half an hour to talk, I just want to flag up a few features of the webinar. So please, as I mentioned earlier, use the chat box to introduce yourselves to other people in the room. There's 70 of us plus the panelists already. I think we're heading towards 100, which will be fantastic. But then if you have questions for the speakers, put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And that's where, after the speakers have finished, we will open up the room to Q&A. What else do I need to tell you? Not much. I think you're probably familiar with this Zoom functionality. So let me go back to Clara and ask her to take us away. Clara.
Thank you very much, Mike. And welcome, everyone. It's very nice to see familiar faces joining, as well as people who I don't know, but I'm looking forward to meeting. So as Mike explained, we're going to be doing this together with my colleagues from the PRISMA and Casa projects. So if we go to the next slide, please, Mike. The way that we're going to structure this webinar is we're going to have a presentation based off of the content that we developed for the guideline. And we're going to pepper that presentation with examples from the practical cases that PRISMA and Casa are going to bring up. This QR code will take you directly to the link where you can download the guideline. And I think Isabel is also going to paste it on the chat box in case you want to download it and read it after this webinar, if you haven't done so already. So moving forward, I'll just very briefly remind everyone why we created this guideline. So the Beam Exchange and the DCD had come to a realization that I think many of us have come to, which is that there is a lack of practical guidance around how we can mainstream greening considerations within our MSD practice. We all know that there is a lot of discussions going around in terms of what climate change and environmental concerns mean for the contexts in which we work, but it's very hard to know how to break those down into operational chunks of information that we can use to inform our MSD programs. And so we had come across questions like the ones that you can see on this screen, where people are really trying to find answers around how they can manage this friction between reaching poverty reduction objectives and promoting environmental sustainability, or how they can engage with market players in different contexts. And I know several of the questions that you had submitted as well before this webinar touch upon these points. We hope we can address most of those during the webinar, and if not, we also have time at the I'll jump right into the next slide, Mike, please, where I just wanted to help people situate themselves a little bit within the guideline. One of the key elements that we had in mind when we developed it was to avoid being dogmatic about what MSD means or what greening environmental considerations may mean in the framework of MSD approaches. We don't want anyone to feel like if they're not already implementing green interventions, they cannot find their way around the guideline. The idea is that everyone who has at least an idea should be able to find inspiration within the guideline. And for that, we included what we call the greening spectrum, where you can situate your project on a scale from having very low greening ambitions on the left-hand side to very high greening ambitions. And the idea here is that you can just think as a team, whichever stage of the project you're at, about what it is that you're trying to implement, what tactics are most appropriate for the type of ambitions that you have, and then use the guideline as you see fit. We don't want anyone to feel like they're not welcome to consider greening their interventions, because everyone can start and do their best within the framework of their project. And then the next slide before I introduce my colleagues, or I hand over to my colleagues. This guideline is structured around the classical MSD program lifecycle. It does require that readers and users be familiar with the MSD approach. So we don't necessarily recommend it for people who are just completely new to MSD, because it does reference a lot of terminology and tools that will be very commonly used and that are already present in the operational guide, which is also a document that is referenced throughout the guideline. It's not meant to replace the operational guide, it's just meant to complement it with some additional information or ideas or tips about how we can start thinking about being more systematic about how we can green our interventions or our portfolios. And during today, we will cover the first 5 stages of the typical program life cycle that you see here, from strategy to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And with this, I hand over, no, you didn't jump the gun, it's fine. I hand over to my colleague Mohasin from PRISMA, who will then also hand over to Innocent from Casa for an overview of the 2 projects that we're going to be discussing throughout the presentation. Mohasin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Clara, and hello, everyone. I hope you are enjoying. So today we'll talk about PRISMA and its journey towards integrating climate change. For those who don't know about PRISMA, PRISMA is a development partnership between the government of Australia and the government of Indonesia. The government of Australia funds PRISMA through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. So the Australia's PRISMA program had an aim of reaching 1 million farming households with at least 30% income increase. By 2023, PRISMA program has reached more than 140% of the target. At the same time, PRISMA has leveraged over $250 million worth of private investment. Mike, you can change the slide. Next one. Yeah, thanks. The PRISMA's target in terms of increasing productivity, because that contributes to the Indonesia's food security and builds farmers' resilience. So with that note, let's hear from Innocent about his program Casa. Innocent, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Mohasin, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking about a specific case under the Casa program, but let me just provide a little bit of quick top-line facts about Casa. Casa is an FCDO-funded program that aims to drive global investment for inclusive climate resilience grow food systems. So pretty much our mandate in that regard is primarily to facilitate positive economic outcomes for the small and medium enterprises that we work with, as well as smallholder farmers around their supply chains. Here in Malawi, we are working in aquaculture and poultry. And let me hasten just to mention that our interest or ambition to green our interventions has kind of evolved over the lifespan of Casa. Next slide, Mike. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So I'll zero in on the case that I wanted to share with you on this occasion. Vipya Chambo, who's one of our SME partner under the aquaculture value chain. So first to just say that at the program level, the strategy setting and selection of sectors was pretty much done by the donor. And within that framework, climate change and environment was programmed to be a cross-cutting theme. However, we as implementers, when we come on the stage in 2019, we had the opportunity to integrate climate change and environment even more at two stages. Number one, when we were doing the comprehensive aquaculture sector market analysis, which led to the development of the inclusive growth strategy. And the fact here to emphasize is that we also had an opportunity to do diagnostic analysis of the space of climate change and environment within the aquaculture value chain. At the second stage, it's where we were now designing the specific intervention that we want to share with you about Vipya Chambo, where of course we engaged in a conversation with the partner on climate change and environment to just understand the experiences, the aspirations, and of course to build that into the design of the project. What we got was that on the environment side, on the environment side, there were issues to do with pond water, wastewater disposal, but there were also issues to do with impact on productivity of the fish, particularly when you have cases of extreme weather conditions impacted by climate change. So next slide. So what we were supposed to do with them and what we did with them is what I want to share in this slide and the next. The gist of the business model that we were supposed to support Vipya Chambo with was centered around their interest to establish fish aggregation and off-taking arrangement with smallholder farmers within a 100-kilometer radius. The motivation for them was commercial. They had unmet demand for fish downstream. And of course, they were also having a competitive advantage because they had a refrigerated truck that they would easily use to off-take fish from smallholder farmers. And that for this pilot to go ahead, Vipya Chambo had requested Casa to support them with the design of the business model, to support them with the BDS, and of course, to support them with mobilization of the smallholder farmers. So what we did to adapt based on the information that we got on the CCE front was that the business and investment plan that we designed for Vipya Chambo to support our continued engagement and partnership was tweaked in a manner that we built in an integration of crop farming around the farm. The idea there was to make sure that we provide an outlet for a productive outlet for waste pond water instead of just draining it and affecting the downstream, whether it is fields or other community members. Number two, we also supported the partner to adapt the production facilities. The ponds were adapted, number one, just to enhance the depth so that we mitigate the issue of whether water will be run dry during dry season, but also to regulate the temperatures within the ponds. And number three, what we also did was to support the partner to adopt planting of trees, the tree species that kind of retain water around the catchment. And this whole support was also built in the training materials that we now wanted Vipya Chambo to provide to the downstream smallholder farmers that were in their supply chain. Next slide. So what was the result? The result was that the original value proposition having changed without necessarily altering their original ambitions in terms of attaining economic economic outcomes. We, at the farmer level, we managed to facilitate adoption of the integration process, and particularly issues of bananas, sugarcane, and of course planting vetiver grass around the pond, but also deepening the dikes, thing that I've already mentioned, creating reservoirs around the pond outlet just to make sure that the water that is coming out of the ponds is not just let nilly-willy downstream. And the result for the firm was quite phenomenal. As we speak now, the income flows from these non-fish value chains for Vipya Jambo makes up 40% of the total income for the firm. But of course, apart from that, there's continued on-skilling of the smallholder farmers around the adaptations that they could make on their ponds, around the adaptations that they could also make around their catchment areas. Oh, next slide.
I guess that's back to me, Innocent.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that presentation. Maybe I should have also mentioned at the beginning that the way we've structured this presentation is we have covered the Casa example first, and we're going to break down the PRISMA example into the different elements of the life cycle. And then that way you have an overview of a full project, and then a project that's broken down into different chunks of the usual MSD life cycle. So thank you, Innocent, again. Well, that's a really interesting example of Casa. You bring up a lot of examples that are also highlighted in the guideline as elements that are important, such as the importance of having that interaction with the donor, where you can continuously iterate and agree on objectives and negotiate what's most important for both. You also include some examples of how it's important to think out of the box in terms of generating value from waste streams, as you did with your pond. So those are all really inspiring examples that also resulted in economic benefits. So thank you for that. And then we're going to start by showcasing we're going to showcase some tools that are in the guideline along each of the different stages of the program lifecycle, starting with strategy. So this is the stage of the program lifecycle where you're conceptualizing your program alongside the donor, or when you're in the inception phase and you're deciding on the strategy for your program. And the section in the guideline covers elements such as procurement, setting up the program strategic framework, and defining overarching objectives for the program. So if you go to the next slide, Mike, one of the elements that I wanted to highlight from what we have in the guideline is actually not a reinvention of the wheel. It's an adaptation from a tool that many of you will be familiar with, which is the sector selection criteria that the ILO developed a few years ago already in one of their guidance notes. And this is a stage where it's important to have an open and ongoing discussion with the donor, because this is where you really start to kind of narrow down the work that you're going to be doing in your project. And I was wondering, Mohasin, if you could tell us a little bit how that process was at PRISMA and what you could share with us from that angle.
Thanks. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the story of PRISMA's climate change integration. So we started at the very low level of the greening spectrum. As you know, the PRISMA's design primarily focused on increasing the productivity and incomes. So obviously we started with an economic objective in mind, but for Australia, addressing climate change has always been a top priority and central to any development cooperation. So for PRISMA as well, environment was a priority thematic area. Although we started at the low level, but what we realized actually was that while doing the constraint analysis, we realized that we must address the climate change, because often farmers are facing challenges because the existing inputs, for example, a seed, is not working against the changed climatic condition. So that gave us some ideas, and we started then navigating through that spectrum. And that greening spectrum actually helped us to set some objectives, identify some sectors based on the questions that you just mentioned, and then also develop a strategic framework. So when we had the economic objective in mind, at the same time, we developed the environmental objectives. And throughout this process, DFAT's support in terms of following and adaptive management was instrumental. We did a lot of proving and improving over the years. And the next slide, Mike. So over time, what we have maintained was a strong portfolio of interventions with proven climate smart agriculture elements. As of December 2023, we had around 67% interventions with climate smart agriculture elements. So that's how the greening spectrum and the selection criteria, all this helped us to navigate through that journey. Over to you, Clara.
Thank you, Mohasin. Yeah, so that's great to hear. As we said at the beginning, that spectrum is a tool that you can use to just understand where you stand and also frame the priorities that you may have, regardless of the degree to which you want to prioritize greening objectives within your program. And it also is a conversation starter to help you in a transition if you want to introduce greener considerations, whether you're a donor or an implementer. So moving on to the diagnosis stage. So as you all know, diagnosis is something that tends to happen at the inception phase and then as needed, because we're all aware of the importance of iteration in our MSD programs. So this section in the guideline covers how to deepen your team's understanding of the sectors that were prioritized initially. You may need to review those. It includes tools for conducting the market systems mapping, and then an idea of how you can frame your root cause identification. So some of the tools that you will find in the, go ahead, Mike, you can go to the next slide. That you can find in this section of the guideline. So most of you will be familiar with, we have donuts. So throughout the guideline, we use the example of a maize market analysis, a hypothetical one, to just show how the diagnosis can then run through to intervention design. But other tools that we include are, for example, the table that you see on the top left, which you can use, and it's not rocket science, but you can use it to discuss as a team how the value chain that you're exploring affects and is affected by the environment. This is adapted from a guidance note that the GIZ prepared a few years ago, which we found quite useful. And then one of the key elements in the diagnosis stage that we highlight is the fact that many MSD programs tend to rush through the rules of the game analysis, but if you're really serious about mainstreaming environmental considerations, then you really need to look at rules, regulations, and norms. And obviously this covers national level, regional level, municipal level, informal rules that you should just be really aware of. And if you don't have that expertise in your team, it's important to invest in making sure that you have it at some point. This section of the guideline covers other analytical tools, and I know not everyone is a big fan of the donut. There's alternatives that you can use, the point being that you need to get to the root cause of the dysfunctions that you're observing. So with that, I would like to get an idea from Gracia about how PRISMA went about it within the rice market system. How did you mainstream greening considerations in your analysis?
Yes, thank you, Clara, for that question. So hi, everyone. I will be sharing PRISMA's experience, as Clara says, as we go through the guideline. Now, before we dive in, why rice? So rice is an important commodity in most Asian countries, and especially in Indonesia. However, its productivity and production is at risk of being stagnant or even dropped due to the challenges imposed by climate change. Now, as a country with one of the highest rice consumption and with a stable population growth, any risk on rice production would be a risk towards the overall nation's food security. Now, today I will share some examples how PRISMA have contributed to addressing and hopefully even reducing these risks. And in the next slide, I will first start on how the program performed its diagnosis. Now, the first step, as in the MSD approach, which Clara has mentioned, is you need to map out the functions and the enabling environment, the rules of the game. It is also where you incorporate the greening lens in your sector analysis. Now, with the current situation around the globe, agriculture and climate change is inseparable. However, it is important still to have the climate concerns reflected at the stage of analysis. Now, for instance, we emphasize the need for farmers not to only use, but also safely use crop protection products. Now, this is because a growing emphasis on environmental friendly practices is needed. Now, on the next slide is a simplified version of the constraint tree. Now, building on the crop protection case, we find that farmers tend to use more than suggested. Now, this could be very detrimental towards the environmental health, and it is resulted from the lack of dissemination by relevant stakeholders on its proper use, in addition to the limited greener alternatives. Now, what is important here is segregating and underlining the environmental impacts and aspects, which would benefit later on when drawing the clear line to the vision and also to the intervention. Now I'll hand it over back to Clara to walk us through the next chapter.
Thank you very much, Gracia. And I see already interesting questions popping up in the Q&A, which is exciting. But okay, so once you've done your strategy, you have your diagnosis, it's time to establish the vision for your portfolio. So this is where you can start formulating hypotheses about what you expect is likely to happen due to the project intervention to address the root causes of the dysfunctions that you've identified through the diagnosis. So this section of the guideline covers how you can bridge the gap between the now and that future that you want to see happening. And it helps you also narrow down the focus of interventions and in pretty standard elements of any MSD project by doing, for example, nested theories of change or intervention strategies that are targeting specifically how you can reach your greening objectives. In the next slide, Mike, you can see again that the guideline does introduce some new tools. So I do encourage everyone to read it and to let us know what they think or if they think they're useful. It also just revisits some classics that are tried and tested, such as the who does who pays, who will do, who will pay, which is quite useful when it comes to creating a shared vision within a team regarding what each function that has been prioritized can lead to. So there's also obviously a consideration to the fact that MSD programs are iterative. So it includes examples of how you can analyze the status quo of a portfolio of interventions and decide whether you want to transition some of the ones that you identify as being more harmful towards a greener side of the spectrum, if we keep using that word. So that's what we cover in the vision stage. And then Gracia, I'd like to ask you, how did you do it at PRISMA within the right sector to link that analysis that you've just explained to the implementation design of interventions?
Yes, thank you again, Clara. So once you have translated the intervention areas based on the root causes, it is, again, as you said, it's important to recheck the chain of logic, whether it links to the greening objectives. Now, what you see in front of you is a slightly modified version of the theory of change. Now, to put it simply, this shows how your defined intervention areas would result to the vision you want to see. Now, what is important here is also to show the greening objectives and how it links to one another. Now, taking the example of soil treatment, the intervention aims for farmers to use eco-friendly fertilizers, and this can be done by introducing alternatives that are less chemical, for instance. Now, by encouraging this function to perform in such a way, it is expected that this will lead to a change in the market, where we want to see farmers have better options of greener fertilizers and also practices. Now, also highlighted in the guideline is the importance of having a portfolio approach. And this is also reflected in this, where we have several functions. And it is also important to ensure that you're not investing all your eggs in one basket, especially as this is an area widely to be explored. Now, again, underlining the climate innovation on each of this layer, it will help clarify later on the linkages of your intervention, your vision towards the greening objectives. Now, I will hand it over back to Clara again to take us through the next exciting chapter on designing and implementing your intervention.
It really is very exciting. And we're almost done. I know I'm very mindful of time. So we only have two more steps to go through. We're now at intervention design and implementation. What this section of the guideline covers is partner engagement strategies and what Gracia just mentioned around managing a portfolio of interventions adaptively, as well as it introduces some thoughts around how we can reinterpret our understanding of scale, considering that the types of objectives that we may end up prioritizing may look quite different. So I'm not going to go into detail into all of those, but Mike, if you go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to show, for example, one of the tools that we included in there. I don't even know if it's a tool, but like one of the ways that you can frame the discussion within your team when it comes to tactics that you can use with different types of partners, right? So obviously, MSD programs are nothing without the right partners on board. So you may need to establish partnerships with different types of partners. Since we're talking about agricultural programs, it's very likely that you may end up working at one point or another with input suppliers. So you may end up working with conventional input suppliers and or with green input suppliers. And if you're at different ends of the spectrum, the way that you engage with them is going to be different. So the guideline includes some tactics that you can use to frame the discussion with these different types of partners. And Gracia, I just wanted to hand it back to you and ask you what PRISMA did in terms of partner engagement, and if you can share some examples with all of us.
Happy to do that. So in order to roll out your green intervention, as Clara has explained, it's also important in getting the partner, obviously. Now, one that I want to share today is tapping into the education institutions. Now, PRISMA's experience shows that the chances that these institutions would already have these green solutions in their hands. But the challenge is that it's not commercialized, or maybe it's not commercialized at a larger scale. Now, one of PRISMA's partner is a rice seed partner, and this partner is actually a business unit of an agriculture institution. And they have a product branded as a climate smart seed. It has features that could withstand drought. And obviously this has the potential to be a superior amongst the others. Now, in some fortunate cases like this, universities would have an existing unit responsible in making these kind of innovations more marketable. However, since the core is education, sometimes managing a business might not yet be a strong suit. Now, this is what takes us to the next step. The form of support the program provides for the partner would vary. This would take different forms depending on what is needed for the partner. Now, for PRISMA, since not all the partners started with being eco-friendly or environmentally friendly in mind, a lot of our support has fallen in building the confidence, capturing evidence, and in terms of market expansion. Now, this could come in a form of action research, and it could be developing promotional strategies, basically to endorse and promote wider adoption of these greener products and practices. Lastly, in the business model PRISMA has supported have been mostly in form of climate smart inputs, such as drought-resistant seeds, more efficient use of fertilizer, but we are also now exploring ways to implement more sustainable practice within the partner's business process, which could potentially reduce production waste and even cost. Now, there are basically many ways of incorporating climate-sensitive MSD interventions, but what is important is really to be vigilant when the opportunity arises. Now, we'll hand it back to Clara to walk us through the last chapter for today.
Yep, the last chapter for the day, thank you, Gracia, is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And I see there was just a question around that, which I hope we can cover during the Q&A session. So obviously, monitoring, evaluation, and learning within MSD programs is not just for accountability purposes, but it's also how we can incorporate good monitoring practices to inform management decisions. How can we populate intervention guides and use them? And how can we generate actionable green knowledge that is available for users in the contexts where we work? And that's what the guideline covers. And so very briefly, the guideline, if you go to the next slide, Mike, includes a laundry list of potential indicators that people can explore and adapt to the context in which they operate. It's not obvious. I don't think it's necessarily something that needs to be explored in detail. It's just like a conversation starter so that you can start deciding on the indicators that are going to be useful to you within the framework of your project to monitor how the interventions that you want to push towards greener outcomes are doing, and use that information to continuously iterate and adapt. And so I was wondering if I could then hand it over to the colleagues at PRISMA to tell us what they can share about their experience conducting MEL within their project.
Okay, so as we conclude the case study of PRISMA, and this will also be my last slide for today. So for PRISMA, measuring environmental impact is an ongoing process, and but I will today share a few that we have been able to measure. Now, once productivity and production increase is confirmed, we then measure environmental impact from the innovation. So for instance, we measure the total emissions saved from the use of the innovation, or in this case, the quality seeds, the more efficient use of fertilizer. And that stands for 45,000 tons carbon dioxide equivalent that is saved. We also measure numbers of farmers who adopted this greener innovation. And in this case, roughly counts for around 405,000 households. Now, other output indicators we have observed includes number of the partners who proactively promote the climate smart agriculture, which are those who have either changed from their products, from their practices or promotion strategies to be more climate smart. And also in terms of the common indicator that shows the start of systemic change, this includes, for instance, the ownership of the model, whether partners have invested more, have a higher sense of belonging, has taken more ownership. We also see the submergence of responding entities, and we have tried to capture that in the slide. Now, as I end my slide, I would like to share a quote from one of our farmers in the humble village of a province in Central Java. In short, he has gained increased productivity and income. However, by adopting these climate smart seeds, he also experienced a shorter planting cycle, which is a beneficial feature for areas with limited water and unpredictable weather. However, he also sees that his cattle preferred the rice straws from the newer seed. So this also results to reduce waste in his farming. Now that is for me today, and I will hand it I will hand it to Mohasin to share more from the program and management level. Over to you.
Thanks, Gracia. Thanks, Gracia. I'll be very quick. So this slide is to show that you can actually negotiate with donors if you have created a good level of impact. So when we talk to DFAT, we thank DFAT for allowing us to measure the climate impact from PRISMA. PRISMA has contributed to emission reduction, which was equivalent to like 1.3 million motorcycles running on gasoline suddenly off the road for a month. More than 1.1 million farming households, they adopted climate smart practices and they benefited from PRISMA's interventions. So that showed that a big program can actually impact equally on the with the environmental objective in focus. Next, so what actually is needed in terms of managing a big program at the same time, focusing on climate along with the economic objectives? Two things I want to mention today and conclude. One is adaptive management. You have to do a lot of proving and improving. So for example, in PRISMA, we follow biannual sector reviews where we look at the changed situation, market conditions. And we hired climate scientists who can help us to identify new challenges and opportunities. And lastly, because PRISMA is ending this year, we focused a lot on generating actionable green knowledge, which means that, what are the business models that work? What are the elements that, do not work? And then finally, supporting the local entities if they want to introduce a new product and services in the market. So that's where PRISMA is focusing now. thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks everyone for listening to this presentation. I will go back to Clara.
To Mike, actually. Mike, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for giving me the final word, which I don't normally do. But since this greening MSD guidance was commissioned by the DCD, very much as an idea from the MSD working group, I'm very pleased to sort of say the last thing and just say we will continue to the one thing that this guidance note doesn't have within it are these practical examples. And that was an active decision not to make the document too long and cumbersome, but also because we wanted to keep it live. So instead what we're doing is we're putting these examples up on a dedicated web page on the Beam Exchange. There's a link there you can see in the slide, and Isabel will post it in the chat to those examples. And right now we have only got one example up actually, which is for the PRISMA example, but we're going to hopefully get lots more up. And if you have ones you would like to share with us, please do send us short case studies or materials that illustrate greening MSD in practice. So otherwise, my other request is, of course, is that you download the guidance and have a look at it and let us know what you think. I'm very keen to get feedback. But let's wind up there and look at the questions. We've run over time, but so I think we're probably going to run over our normal hour because we've only got 20 minutes left now. So let's assume that we might carry on a little bit longer than we normally do, because I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions to answer. I'm just looking at the questions that you've posted. Remember not to put them in the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Let me start by going to a question that Jane Lewicki-Zucker from USAID put into the question and answer box. And I don't know, Clara, which of you would be best placed to answer this. The question is, can you speak to the focus on socioeconomic inclusion within the approach to greening MSD? For example, how are employment pathways and outcomes considered, including thinking about more and better jobs, just transitions for youth, inclusion of women, and so on? Is that something that we could, I mean, maybe, I don't know whether that's something that you would like to speak to, Gracia or Clara?
I can actually try from PRISMA's perspective, actually.
Yeah.
So what we do in PRISMA, basically, we go back to our original guideline and try to find out, okay, who are the people neglected market segment? And there often we find that these segments like women, they are more affected by climate change than the other market segments. And then we try to find out, okay, what can we do? How can we engage them into the main market system? And that's where we find the strategy. Now, I have also seen there is another question related to trade-offs, and it is related to this one. So when you look at these kind of neglected market segments, and there is obviously a trade-off, you can probably impact 100,000 farming households, but because you are focusing on environmental objective and then inclusion, maybe you will end up reaching 10,000, but you are building resilience and you're making sure that these 10,000 are resilient against any shocks in the future.
Thank you, Mohasin. I was going to go straight to that question, actually, from Paul Kiernan and at FAO. I don't know if anyone else, maybe Innocent, would you like to respond to it? This is the question that says, I'm interested in the trade-off conversation that highlighted the compromises of integrating climate and environmental considerations into projects. What were the main trade-offs identified? How were these explained and agreed upon with participants? And what were the actual trade-off outcomes in these projects? I don't know, Innocent, is that something that you might be able to talk about in relation to the Casa program?
Yes, thank you, Mike. And yeah, so I think there are two things that I wanted to zero in there. The primary cost there is that there is obviously an extra investment that is required in terms of financial resources for most of the greening solutions that you would want the partners or the smallholder farmers to adopt. Number two, it is the time. If it is not the cost in terms of finances. It is the time that practitioners or actors in the market system need to invest to wait for the outcomes. I'll give you one example at the firm level. So we also work in Portly. We had a partner who we supported to think through the idea of improving their heating heating of their production systems. These are chicken houses. By running away from the usual traditional charcoal, and the cost was enormous. It was more than 60% of the initial, or 60% more than the initial cost. But then we had to distill the information to demonstrate what is it that would be beneficial at the end of the day. So you bring on board the benefits that would accrue, or particularly downstream, in this case, to the farmers. And once you demonstrate that, apart from the investment in the finances to put up or to use inputs that are green, in this case, using either sustainable charcoal or electric energy, then at the end of the day also you find that the marketing side responds. In this case, the markets are becoming sensitive to how the product is produced, and there's a lot of promotional messages against products that are using unsustainable ways of production.
If I could
I think I could stop there, but something that I also wanted to share at the farmer level, smallholder farmer level. So for the smallholder farmer, I think for us, I'll go back to the VP Chambo case, where you also need to distill the information to sound very practical. In our case, we had to use the immediate benefits that would accrue. In this case, for instance, the farmers were able to use pond wastewater, which would ideally not be useful for productive uses. In this case, irrigating the adjacent crops that were integrated in fish farming. So the revenue from these adjacent crops was quite significant in many cases, and we've gone back to these farmers to check that they still continue, and for some of the farmers, they have even kind of diverted. Fish farming has become a secondary value chain because the benefits that they get from the other value chains that are using the pond wastewater are becoming more and more beneficial to them overall.
I can just add very quickly to what Innocent mentioned. I completely agree with what he mentioned, and just in terms of at a conceptual level, the trade-offs that we often encountered when we were preparing these guidelines are the fact that people will tell you, yes, of course, I would like to incorporate environmental protection considerations within the program design, but I have these very ambitious poverty reduction objectives that I have to achieve within 4 years. So something's got to give. It's impossible for us as implementers to reach both. If we're going to reach the outcome that 5,000 farmers increase their income, it's going to have to come at the expense of environmental protection. And that's been the general belief that most people have had, at least in our experience coming into this work. And a useful way of framing that trade-off, to answer Paul's question as well, is to just say it, okay, you may have that trade-off within the short term of a 4-year implementation life cycle, but think about the trade-off in terms of longer term results, right? So what's going to happen if you prioritize conventional agriculture that's going to result in soil erosion over the next few years? What does that mean for that same household 20 years from now, right? And so the trade-offs are between the now and the future, as much as they are between economic gain in the short term and environmental protection. And I think that's a tension that we see very often is hard to navigate, mainly when there is no agreement between the donor and the implementer. So yeah, over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to go to a question by from Dedi, which actually he said it's for you, Clara, but I'd like to bring in another colleague from PRISMA called Nasir. If you're Nasir, are you? Yeah, there you are. Great, Nasir. So I don't know if you saw Dedi's question. The question is, in implementing the greening MSD approach, what specific methodological frameworks or tools can be employed to ensure rigorous measurement and evaluation of the environmental sustainability outcomes?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I'll try to share the experience from PRISMA, and then later Clara can further add into that. So in PRISMA, we have developed a low-cost and simple measurement framework for climate change impact. And this framework is actually mainstreamed within the project's monitoring and evaluation process, which means this is not a standalone or a separate exercise. And we also recognize that PRISMA, like many other agriculture projects, do not contribute to absolute emission reduction, but relative emission reduction, which comes from lower emission intensity. For example, intensity per ton of production is lower. Now, how do we measure that in PRISMA? The measurement framework involves a calculation table for measuring carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from the use of nitrogen-based fertilizer like NPK or urea in Indonesia. And this comes to around 13.01 kg of CO2 equivalent emission only from use of 1 kg nitrogen-based fertilizer. And the sources of this emission for this 13.01 kg of CO2 equivalent emission, it includes the emission during the production process of the fertilizer, during the transportation process, during the application, and direct nitrous oxide into soil emission, or indirect nitrous oxide that is released during, for example, leaching process. Now, once we have the table for the emission amount from using 1 kg of nitrogen-based fertilizer, we use a simple step-by-step process. In the first step, we identify 4 key variables. The first one is the number of farmers who are adopting mitigating measures. In this case, less usage of nitrogen-based fertilizer, and complementing it with other balanced fertilizer application process, for example, using mineral-based or organic fertilizer. The second variable is the average land size of the farmers. The third one is the change in practice. In this case, it will be the reduction or the less usage of nitrogen-based fertilizer. And the fourth variable is the increase in yield or productivity due to using balanced fertilizer. Then we collect data for all these 4 variables for 2 sets of farmers. The treatment group, farmers who have adopted climate smart ag practices, and control group who continue to use traditional practices. And then finally, we compare those emission intensity based on fertilizer usage, land size, and the productivity rate for both the treatment group and the control group, and by using a before and after situation to get the results in terms of relative emission reduction. And from like fertilizer interventions in PRISMA, we have identified that PRISMA contributed to nearly 72,000 metric tons of relative CO2 emission reduction. That is a kind of a summary how we measure emission reduction using a simple but pragmatic process. The key principles here are that we try to keep it low cost to reduce the measurement cost, but at the same time, the framework is flexible enough so that it helps us to capture all the indicators which are important or critical to measure, learn, and also report on climate change mitigation steps. And for adaptive measures, we do not use any quantitative indicators because there is no universal set of indicators for measuring climate change adaptation. It varies depending on context and countries and the project. We use more qualitative indicators for measuring adaptation. Clara, if you would like to add more, or over to you, Mike.
I don't think there's much to add, Nasir. You're very comprehensive. I would just quickly say that I think that not all projects are going to have the same resources as PRISMA to invest in this very, very thorough approach to measuring environmental effects. So I would just say that what the guideline does say is that you can right size your efforts to the budget that you have and just pick the indicators that are going to be more useful. And in some cases that will mean focusing on qualitative indicators. Again, not rocket science, pretty standard practice in MSD, but you shouldn't be put off by the fact that a lot of these indicators are very technical and require expertise if there is no budget for that within your project. But PRISMA is definitely a best case example in this sense.
Thank you, Clara. So look, I'm just going to say, because we're getting close to the time when we would normally wrap up. I think we'll carry on a little bit, but if you have to leave anyway, because you've got something else, please, thank you very much for coming along. Please do give us some feedback on the webinar. There's a link in the chat to a feedback form, very quick 2-minute job. Give us some idea of what you enjoyed or didn't enjoy about this webinar. That'd be very helpful. Otherwise, I'm gonna carry on with some questions and expect we will lose some people, but maybe others can hang on for another 10 minutes. I wanted to turn to actually a couple of the questions at the top of the list, which are kind of related. One was from Franz Miralles in Swiss Contact, the others from Maureen. I don't know which organization Maureen works for. Both are kind of asking about prioritizing at the sector selection stage, how you assess, if you like, how you deal with the trade-off between kind of choosing to work in a sector which is environmentally friendly, maybe, or as opposed to maybe choosing to work in a sector which is actually quite environmentally problematic, but where there's more potential to have a positive change. In other words, where there's opportunities to transition to greener or more sustainable practices. Clara, I don't know if you want to try and address these two questions.
Sure.
Green versus green potential, I think, is the way that Maureen put it.
Yeah, and I do have to drop off at the hour, so I do have another call.
Okay.
So that will be my my last one, because I do think it's a very important question, and it's sort of similar to the question around the trade-offs, right? And it links back to what Gracia was mentioning about having a portfolio approach and about what we developed the guidelines with in mind when we did it, right? So it's clear that some of the projects that are going to be asked to green their interventions are not going to manage to do that 100% from day one. The idea is that if you're reading the guideline, it's because you have some sort of ambition to transition towards a greener portfolio. So I don't think there is any argument that in some cases it's justified to work in sectors that are more, that are conventional and that may have negative environmental impacts at some point. The question is how much you want to move away from them and how are you compensating for those by intervening in other sectors that are maybe within the middle ground in that spectrum that we presented at the beginning. So that would be what I would say. And I thank everyone for great questions. Bye.
Well, I would thank you, Clara, for a great manual, a great guidance note. It's a real asset for us in the MSD world to have this greening MSD guidance, and I hope that it will be much talked about over the next year as it comes into use. And we'd love to hear people's feedback on it as well. So do let us know. I think, given that Clara has to leave, I think we should probably wrap up. There are a few questions that we didn't get to, I'm sorry, but with, please do write to us, or maybe we'll get a chance to write to you if you leave your email address in the chat box. Please do give us feedback in the chat as well. That would be really helpful. Otherwise, can I just thank Mohasin, Garcia, and Innocent? I think you're still with us, aren't you? Although you're not visible. For your contributions to this webinar, I really enjoyed the cases. It really brought things down to earth and made it very practical.